Hello, everybody. Welcome to CI/CD Through the Ages. This is effectively a history lesson. It's actually an abridged version of a much longer talk I give with only the cool history parts. Here we go. A couple of you saw me yesterday. I recognize you. So I'll be brief about the introduction to myself. That's me. That's my cat, Espresso. She's very cute. She likes attention. She wants to be involved in all of my talks. When I'm presenting virtually, she's usually in my lap, like screaming her tiny little head off. So it only seems fair to involve her in the live talks too. But I'm a developer advocate at Pulumi. It's an infrastructure as code company. If you would like to get a hold of me later, because there may not be much time for questions at the end here, my Twitter handle is Dixie3Flatline. You can also try emailing me at cat@pulumi.com, but I'm not good at responding to emails. So a Twitter DM is like genuinely faster. I know it seems wildly unprofessional, but I'm a developer advocate and we don't actually have to be super professional all the time. So I didn't get where I am through like strictly traditional means. I did go to college, but I went to college for biochemical engineering, and also I dropped out of college. So I spent a long time as a bartender, as a waitress. I spent a few years working at an independent video rental store as their resident horror expert and eventually as their database administrator. And the way I took to get to tech as an engineer taught me a lot of interesting lessons that I don't think you would learn otherwise, but I also saw a lot of problems that people tend to consistently have regardless of how they get into tech. One of those is like the history of the tooling we use. We tend to assume that things are much newer than they are or much older than they are. And in this case, we're talking about one that is much older than we like to think, considering how young DevOps is as a concept. So today I'm going to be talking about CI/CD and how it has changed over time. It has changed a lot, actually. And we talk about CI/CD now like it's one thing, but it's actually two distinct pieces. The CI stands for continuous integration, and the CD can stand for either continuous delivery or continuous deployment. I do not like that there are two different definitions of CD, and I think you should just automate the deploy, but that's an argument for another conference talk. So let's look at the history here. Continuous integration has actually been a thing for a very long time. It's been around since the early 90s. It hasn't always been called that, and some of the specific implementation has changed, but the spirit has remained the same. You merge changes into source in smaller and more frequent increments, test that the project still builds and runs with those changes, and make sure your engineers are all working from the most recent version of source, right? Sounds familiar? You do that, and you don't end up with a ton of merge conflicts or surprise problems when it comes time to build and deploy. And this was first proposed by a man named Grady Booch all the way back in 1991 in a book called Object-Oriented Analysis and Design with Applications. Some of you may be old enough to have read that in school. I super am not, but I was one when that book came out. But the Booch method advocated for making more frequent use of classes and objects in programming in order to simplify design. His version of continuous integration didn't suggest releasing multiple times a day, though. That didn't happen until 1997, when extreme programming became a thing. And it built on the Booch method by advocating for releasing multiple times a day. This kind of changed the game, honestly, and I know that the name sounds like really absurd now. It gives you like big 1990s skateboarding, hardcore, edgy product marketing vibes, but at the time it didn't mean that. That's a view we've put upon it decades later. At the time it meant taking things that were already part of software development and taking them to the extreme. So instead of just having code review, you have pair programming, which is effectively just constant code review. This also gave us much shorter release cycles. We got unit testing out of it, acceptance testing, all is standard practices when writing software. We're still doing all of these things, even though we're not really calling it extreme programming now. We're calling it something else. All of these things make our lives easier now. They radically improve quality for us and for our users. There's really not a downside. And over time, more and more methodologies have built on these things that came to us in the early 90s, from Scrum to Kanban to Agile, all with one goal in mind: to make it easier to write clearer, higher quality code and get it to users faster. In the early days, while we recognized that we needed to be releasing more often, we didn't actually have tools to do that. We didn't get the first open source option until like 2001 with the release of Cruise Control. Now, this is not the actual logo for Cruise Control, and I love this slide because it's a fun visual gag. I couldn't find a version of their logo with a transparent background because the ping image format, which is the image format that supports background transparency, wasn't widely supported by browsers until Internet Explorer 9, which was released in 2011, 1 year after the last update to Cruise Control. So it's, I don't know, I thought it was funny. That's how old it is, and people actually still use this. I find that alarming, but people do still use this. Anyway, Cruise Control was revolutionary at the time of its release, because for the first time, we had a system that you could install and stand up yourself to automate the management of builds, which allowed us to release way more of them. It even integrated with your IDE if you were using Eclipse. Cruise Control was Java-specific. If you were writing, say, Ruby or something, you needed to use a Ruby variant of Cruise Control, and there were a few different variants of it. And eventually it was overtaken by Jenkins. This is still widely in use today. Some of you have probably touched it. It supports a ton of different languages. It can be made to do almost anything you want. And it has an enormous community around it so that when you do run into difficulties, it's almost certain that somebody else has run into that problem before and documented the solution for you. It's stable, it's secure, and it's popular. However, Jenkins is starting to show its age a bit. You have to stand up the infrastructure and install it yourself, and someone has to be responsible for maintaining it. This is true even to an extent with Jenkins X, their newer cloud-native offering. So the cloud has arrived. At this point, we're pretty close to present day in the procession of products that do this. And we've got all of these self-hosted CI tools like Jenkins kind of losing some ground to things that you don't have to babysit as much, like Circle CI or GitHub Actions. These are very, very easy to get up and running, even to just figure out if, DevOps is the place you want to go and learn yourself some CI/CD. These also support dozens of languages and build environments. They know how to deal with cloud-native technologies like Docker and Kubernetes, usually straight out of the box. And they integrate directly with a whole bunch of other services to handle deployment or analytics or observability or whatever. It's both more flexible and lower maintenance, but there is an argument that there's like a security concern since you're not 100% in control of your CI system. I will leave that argument to someone who's actually an expert in security, which is not me. But for a lot of people, this is a completely acceptable trade-off. For me, it is. I guess unless you're using Travis CI, because they had that real nasty secrets leak about a month ago. So that's how CI/CD came to be. That's how we got to where we are today. But here's what it has actually looked like in practice at various points throughout history. If you're around my age or older, I'm 31, you probably remember how much drama used to be involved in a software update. It was not unusual to wait like a year plus for an update to a piece of software you were using. And that update was going to be massive. The changelog was going to be inscrutable. It was almost certainly going to be wildly buggy in some way, and updating anything was a big to-do. You couldn't just casually say, oh yeah, I'll update my whatever. It was genuinely a lot of work at the time and a wildly inconvenient experience. If you're younger than me, that might kind of sound ridiculous now, but can you imagine waiting that long to release an update if you are already a software engineer today? If you have been a software engineer, can you imagine going back to that? I can't. It sounds miserable. In a lot of situations, it was not actually possible to just download an update. The manufacturer had to provide you with the update via some kind of physical media, whether that meant a floppy disk or a USB drive. And this has not been dead for that long. The last time I had to do this was in 2009 when I was working at that video store. We needed to update the point of sale system that handled our rental database, and the manufacturer could only provide us with the update via mailing me a USB drive in 2009. They would not just email me the executable. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but in, I guess, defense of that situation, they still used a serial dongle to verify the license. This does still exist in some industries, but it's exceedingly rare. We've also seen problems with phones doing this. The way phone updates have progressed has been pretty wild. In the 90s, you wanted Snake on your phone, right? You couldn't just update your phone to a version that had Snake. You had to get a whole new phone. Eventually, we got to a point where you could update the OS on your phone and get new features, but it required plugging your phone into a computer with a physical cable. That hasn't been dead for that long either. Eventually, cloud storage became a little bit more ubiquitous, and this became a fairly painless process. Switching phones or updating your phone happens via the cloud. If you move to a new phone, all of your contents and your apps and your photos and phone numbers are all just there after a few minutes of processing time. But over the course of 20-ish years, we've gone from a point where you have to buy a new phone to get a game on it to a point where, does anybody in this room know what the version number is of the Netflix app or the Twitter app on their phone? Anybody? You don't, because it just updates overnight. Unless you're one of those people that forces manual updates on your phone. Some people do. I do for some apps. You don't know what version it is anymore. It happens automatically. You don't think about it. It could be updating once a day, and you wouldn't know, because it's changed that much and gotten that much easier because we have CI/CD now. We've gotten much, much better at this over time, from this is extremely painful to I literally don't notice this occurring, which is pretty cool to me. Come on, go to my next slide. Let's do it. So there is a reason to pay a lot of attention to this that isn't just convenience, and that's the security concern. So I know I'm in the UK, but I'm going to talk about the Equifax breach briefly. A few years ago, Equifax had a very serious security breach that resulted in the personal information of something like 150 million Americans being stolen, including our names, our birth dates, our addresses, and most importantly, our social security numbers. So anybody could steal our identities. And this breach happened because hackers were able to exploit a particular CVE that had been known for months that Equifax didn't check for in the extremely popular web framework Apache Struts. This had been disclosed in March, publicly disclosed, and it was a huge thing in the security industry. It was given a CVSS score of 10, which means, oh my God, shut it down, find every instance of this, and patch it, immediately. But they just didn't, and let it sit there for 2 months vulnerable. The hackers didn't actually exploit that vulnerability until May. And they stayed undetected in Equifax's systems for 4 months. Once Equifax did figure it out, it took them 2 further months to find and update every instance of the vulnerable version of Apache Struts. And that's absolutely wild. They should have been able to respond to that quickly. If they had been able to respond to that quickly by, having a CI/CD system in place, maybe I wouldn't have credit monitoring for free for the rest of my life. I mean, the free credit monitoring is cool and all, but it's not the most fun thing to have to deal with. So that's the history of CI/CD, from the tools we used in the beginning to the tools we use now, and how it's gone from wildly inconvenient to, because we didn't really have the tools for it, to something that an entire ecosystem exists around to make this easy for us to do, so that we have been able to go from installing a software update is a massive pain that I would like to avoid at all costs because it's going to take down my production systems and be buggy and weird for weeks until we figure out what's wrong, to I don't care and I don't think about it, which I think is a pretty incredible progression in, just 30 years. So thanks. I hope I helped you understand the history of CI/CD, and that was vaguely interesting to you. Reach out to me if you have questions, and I'll stand in the hallway for a few minutes too.